The forward arming and refueling point, nestled deep in a high-altitude mountain valley, was a shimmering showcase of the 21st century military's technological might. Gleaming state-of-the-art V-22 Ospreys sat with their massive rotors tilted skyward, their composite bodies humming with the silent, latent power of 1,000 complex computer systems. Young, confident pilots in custom flight gear moved around them, their heads buried in data slates, discussing intricate flight vectors and predictive weather models with an almost religious fervor. And then there was the other side of the airfield. Tucked away near a dilapidated maintenance shed, looking less like an active military asset and more like a forgotten museum piece, sat a single, old UH-1 Huey. Its olive-drab paint was faded to the color of dried moss, its fuselage a patchwork of old repairs and sealed rivets, each one telling a silent story. It was a relic, a dinosaur from a bygone era of analog dials, mechanical linkages, and raw, visceral feedback. And leaning against its open cargo door, a silent sentinel, was Warrant Officer Anya Petrova. Her flight suit was worn, comfortable, bearing the subtle marks of countless hours in the cockpit. Her hands were calloused, testimony to years of wrestling a stubborn machine through unforgiving skies. Her call sign, spoken with a mixture of affection and perhaps a touch of pity by the younger, more technologically inclined pilots, was Mama Bear. The squadron's young, data-obsessed commander, Major Kent, was currently giving a tour to a visiting congressman, gesturing proudly at his gleaming Ospreys. This, sir, is the future. Fully automated, AI-assisted, capable of flying in conditions that would have grounded a whole generation of older aircraft. He then pointed a dismissive thumb towards Anya's humble Huey. And that, he added, his voice laced with clear disdain, is what we used to fly. A museum piece, more of a danger to its own pilot, one might argue, than to the enemy. The congressman chuckled politely, perhaps a bit uncomfortably. The young Osprey pilots predictably smirked, sharing knowing glances. Anya heard the comment, clear as a bell across the expanse of the airfield. She didn't react, not outwardly. She just looked up at the sky, at the strange, heavy, greenish-gray clouds that were beginning to gather ominously over the highest peaks. She had seen clouds like that before once, a long time ago in another unforgiving landscape, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the mountain air, that the storm they were about to unleash was not in any of the Major's sophisticated predictive weather models. The desperate, static-laced plea for help that cut through the sterile, controlled quiet of the Tactical Operations Center was unmistakably the sound of the future failing. It was the leader of a Special Forces team. Call sign Goliath, his voice raw with pain and urgency, pinned down and bleeding out on a high, inaccessible mountain ridge. Mayday, Mayday, we have multiple critical casualties. We were ambushed during exfil. We need immediate medevac. Repeat, we need a bird in the air now. But the world outside had, with terrifying suddenness, dissolved into a maelstrom of white. A violent, freakish thunder snowstorm had descended upon the mountains, a furious, swirling vortex of wind, ice, and constant crackling lightning. In the command center, Major Kent stared at his dead weather displays, his face pale, slick with a cold sweat. All his advanced, multi-million-dollar Ospreys were now completely grounded, their sensitive, fly-by-wire systems and delicate composite rotors no match for the severe icing conditions and the intense electromagnetic interference from the storm. The rescue mission was, by every metric in his meticulous book, utterly impossible. He made the call, his voice tight with a mixture of regret and perhaps professional self-preservation. Goliath, be advised, all air assets are grounded. Repeat, all assets are grounded. We cannot reach you. Hunker down and wait for the storm to pass. It was, for all intents and purposes, a death sentence, delivered with chilling detachment. And then, a new sound. An unexpected sound cut through the panicked, desperate silence on the radio, pushing past the crackling static. It was not the sound of modern technology failing. It was the deep, familiar, reassuring whump 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 of a two-bladed helicopter rotor. A sound that was as analog and as brutally simple as a heartbeat. A rhythmic pulse of defiance. It was Anya. She had taken off without clearance, a lone, defiant ghost ascending into the very heart of the storm. A single olive-drab silhouette against the swirling white. She keyed her mic, her voice as calm and as steady as the beat of her rotors, a lifeline thrown across the void. Goliath, this is Mama Bear. The future is grounded. The past is on its way. Stay alive. I'm coming to get you. The culture at the high-altitude forward operating base was, it was often said, a stark reflection of the new military. It was a place that valued youth, technological fluency, and an almost unwavering faith in the predictive power of data. Major Kent was, truly, the perfect embodiment of this new philosophy. He was a brilliant, ambitious officer with a master's degree in systems analysis, a man who believed with almost religious conviction that the chaos of the battlefield could be tamed and ultimately defeated by a superior algorithm. He saw his squadron of V-22 Ospreys not merely as aircraft, but as flying supercomputers, complex digital extensions of his own formidable intellect. Their pilots, in his view, were not just warriors, but highly trained systems managers, adept at interpreting data rather than visceral feedback. Warrant Officer Anya Mama Bear Petrova and her ancient, battered UH-1 Huey were consequently a constant, often deeply inconvenient embarrassment to him. Anya was a relic from a different era entirely, a woman who had spent 30 years flying helicopters in the most unforgiving environments on Earth, from the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia to the freezing peaks of the Hindu Kush. She flew not by the numbers projected on a screen, but by the raw, almost organic feel of the machine vibrating through her spine, by the subtle tension in the cyclic and collective, by an intuitive, almost mystical understanding of the wind and the ever-changing weather patterns. She commanded a small, fiercely loyal crew of older, grizzled veterans, men who, like her, were seen as dinosaurs, clinging stubbornly to a world that, in the eyes of the new guard, no longer truly existed. Kent and his young, cocky Osprey pilots treated them with a kind of polite, condescending pity, the way one might perhaps treat a senile but once respected grandfather whose stories were tolerated but whose capabilities were long dismissed. Anya, for her part, met their dismissive glances with a quiet, unreadable gaze, her focus always on the sky, on the machine, on the mission that always, ultimately came down to raw skill, not computer models. The mission of Goliath Team was a high-stakes Black Ops affair, cloaked in the deepest secrecy. They were a small, elite special forces unit, tasked with planting a surveillance device on a remote high-altitude enemy radar station. The insertion had been flawless, a testament to the surgical precision of the Ospreys that had delivered them with such effortless speed and quiet efficiency. They had moved like ghosts, performed their task with silent precision, and had almost made it out as waiting. What was Goliath? But the exfiltration, tragically, had turned into a catastrophic disaster. The enemy, perhaps alerted by some unforeseen signal or simply by cruel chance, had set a trap. The team found themselves pinned down in a brutal, close-quarters firefight, taking heavy casualties. Their only escape route, a sheer 1,000-foot drop down an unforgiving cliff face. Their survival depended entirely on an immediate hot extraction by air, a desperate snatch and grab before they were overwhelmed. But the mountain and the sudden furious storm it had birthed had other, far more brutal ideas. The thunder snowstorm, a rare and incredibly violent weather phenomenon, had descended upon the range with a speed and a fury that had defied all the sophisticated predictive models Major Kent so heavily relied upon. It was a perfect storm of the worst possible conditions, hurricane-force winds that screamed through the peaks, heavy, wet snow that instantly froze to any surface it touched, creating deadly ice, and a constant, terrifying barrage of lightning strikes that turned the air itself into a crackling electromagnetic minefield, utterly disrupting modern avionics. The Ospreys, with their delicate composite rotor blades and their complex, vulnerable fly-by-wire computer systems, were utterly useless. Their digital brains, designed for precision in predictable environments, simply locked up in the face of such overwhelming analog chaos. The rescue mission was, by every metric in the book, by every algorithm in Major Kent's arsenal, fundamentally impossible. The mountains had effectively sealed their fate. In the command center, Major Kent stared at his dead weather displays, which now flickered with meaningless static, his face a mask of impotent frustration and dawning despair. He had made the agonizing call. The mission was a scrub. The men of Goliath team, he rationalized, were a tragic, but in the cold calculus of command, an acceptable loss. The doctrine, after all, was clear. You do not risk a $20 million aircraft and the precious lives of its crew for a mission with a near-zero probability of success. It was the only logical decision, he told himself, even as his stomach churned. Anya Petrova, who had been quietly, intently listening to the desperate, fading radio calls of the dying, stranded soldiers, did not see probabilities. She saw men. She saw life. She walked into the command center, her old, worn flight suit a stark, almost defiant contrast to the crisp, clean uniforms of the officers who were now, quite visibly, in a state of barely controlled panic. "Sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the murmuring tension, her eyes locked on his with an unwavering intensity. "My bird can fly in this." Kent turned on her, his face flushed with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and perhaps a touch of fear at her audacity. "Warrant, officer," he practically barked. "Your bird is a 30-year-old flying antique. It doesn't have the power to fight these hurricane-force winds. It doesn't have the de-icing equipment to survive this kind of cold. And it sure as hell doesn't have the shielding to survive a direct lightning strike. I have given a direct order. All aircraft are grounded. Are you deaf as well as obsolete?" Anya looked at the Major, at the warring emotions visible in his eyes, the fear of failure, the pride of his new machines, the desperation of his current situation. And then, without hesitation, she made a decision that would forever define her. She saluted, a crisp, perfect, and utterly insubordinate gesture, a silent challenge to his authority. "I hear your order, sir," she said, her voice as cold and as hard as the ice forming on the command center windows. "But the men of Goliath team are not an acceptable loss. Not to me." And with that she turned and walked out, leaving a stunned, speechless command staff in her wake, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. She was not just disobeying a direct order. She was committing an act of open, professional rebellion, a defiance that risked her entire career, perhaps even her freedom. But the lives of those men, she knew, were worth any price. The journey of the old Huey into the very heart of the thunder snowstorm was indeed a descent into a special, almost unimaginable kind of hell. The world outside the cockpit was a terrifying nightmare of swirling white and blinding, strobing lightning, each flash illuminating a maelstrom of ice and snow. The wind, howling through the mountain passes with the sound of 1,000 screaming demons, slammed into the helicopter with the brute force of a physical blow, threatening to tear its old weathered frame apart. The heavy, wet snow instantly froze to the windshield, forming a thick, opaque sheet of ice, forcing Anya to fly with her head out of the side window, the wind and the ice and the snow, a brutal, relentless physical assault on her exposed face. Her goggles fogged, Her cheeks stung, but her eyes, narrowed with grim determination, never left the swirling landscape ahead. This was a world that would have instantly defeated the Ospreys with their delicate computer-controlled systems and fragile composite materials. But the Huey, Anya knew, was a different kind of beast entirely. It was a simple, brutally honest, and profoundly reliable machine. It was all mechanical linkages, thick hydraulic fluid, and raw, screaming, unadulterated power. It was, in essence, a flying tractor, a brute force marvel of an earlier age. And Anya Petrova was, without a doubt, the best damn tractor driver in the world, having tamed the beast through decades of sheer will and intimate understanding. She fought the storm not with algorithms or predictive models, but with her bare hands, her entire body an extension of the machine, feeling every shudder, every lurch, every subtle, treacherous shift in the wind, and countering it with a constant fluid dance of the cyclic and pedals. She was not a systems manager, calmly interpreting data. She was, in the truest sense of the word, a pilot, a direct interface between human will and mechanical power, pushing the limits of both. Her knuckles were white, her muscles screamed in protest, but her resolve was unbreakable. Each gust of wind was a personal challenge, each lightning flash a moment to recalibrate, to push harder, to simply fly. At the head of the helicopter, in the co-pilot seat, sat Eva Rostova. She was not flying. Certainly, she was, instead, navigating. Her role as crucial as Anya's in this maelstrom. In her lap, illuminated by the dim red glow of a map light, was not a sleek GPS tablet or a holographic display, but an old, worn, and much folded paper topographical map, its creases softened by years of use. In one hand, she held a simple, liquid-filled compass, its needle a stubbornly reliable guide amidst the electronic chaos. This was a form of navigation that was as ancient as the mountains themselves, relying on raw observation and deeply ingrained knowledge, rather than fragile signals. While Major Kent and his staff in the command center saw the storm and the intense electromagnetic interference as an insurmountable, mission-killing obstacle, Eva, with a quiet, knowing confidence, saw it as an unexpected advantage. The storm, she reasoned, blinded the enemy as much as it blinded them, creating a veil of natural chaos. And crucially, while the enemy's advanced radar and ground patrols would undoubtedly be watching the predictable, GPS-based routes, the main roads, the known passes, she was taking a different path entirely. She was guiding their lumbering convoy, not just the Huey but the ground vehicles, through a forgotten network of old, barely visible logging trails and treacherous smugglers' paths, routes that were not on any official military map, routes that existed only in the deeply etched memories of the old men who had worked these mountains for generations, and fortunately for them, on the faded, meticulously pencil-marked pages of her own, highly personal, hand-drawn map. She was not just navigating in a conventional sense, she was engaged in an intimate, intuitive dialogue with the terrain itself, a conversation that the cold, binary logic of a computer, no matter how advanced, could never hope to understand. Her fingers, rough and calloused, traced the contours of the land, feeling the subtle shifts in elevation, anticipating the hidden ravines, and somehow, by a wisdom gleaned from years of intimate connection with this brutal landscape, finding the path through the impossible. Every decision was a calculated risk, every turn a leap of faith, guided by a compass and decades of silent observation. Eva knew, with the quiet, chilling certainty of long, hard-won experience, that the enemy would have anticipated a rescue attempt, and she knew with equal certainty that they, like Major Kent and his team in the command center, would be thinking in terms of modern, predictable tactics, relying heavily on technology and established patterns. They would have, she deduced, meticulously mined the main roads, the broad valleys. They would have set up intricate ambushes on the most obvious, GPS-friendly routes, the very same routes the Ospreys, the golems as the younger pilots called them, would have taken in normal conditions. So Eva, embracing the unpredictable, did the one thing they would never expect. She took a drastic detour, based on a faded, almost illegible note scribbled years ago on her old paper map. A note she had made after a casual conversation with an old local shepherd who knew these mountains intimately. She guided her convoy, not just the Huey but the ground vehicle she was directing, off the main track and onto a treacherous, barely visible path that led through a narrow, high-walled canyon. It was a longer, far more dangerous route, a path that twisted and turned, barely wide enough for the heavy trucks, a route that would push the skills of her pilots and drivers to their absolute limit. But it was also, crucially, a route that the enemy in their modern, predictable, algorithm-driven thinking would have summarily dismissed as utterly impossible, too risky, too illogical for any conventional military force. As the dinosaur convoy, a name now spoken with new, quiet reverence among her crew, rumbled painstakingly through the heart of the canyon, they passed less than a kilometer from a large, heavily armed enemy force. This enemy unit was sitting in a perfectly prepared and now completely useless ambush on the main road, their advanced sensors scanning empty air, patiently waiting for a convoy that, thanks to Eva's unconventional wisdom, would never arrive. The bitter cold of the storm which had grounded the Ospreys now served as a cloak, muffling the sounds of their passage, allowing them to slip past the unseen enemy like ghosts. It was a silent, profound victory, won not by superior technology, but by superior understanding of the land and of human, rather than digital, intuition. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity of battling the screaming wind, the blinding snow, and the treacherous ice, the Huey, battered, mud-splattered, but miraculously unbroken, finally rumbled into the small makeshift clearing below. The men of Goliath team had prepared for their last stand, their faces grim, their weapons ready for a fight they expected to lose. For these exhausted, desperate Special Forces soldiers, the sight of the old, ugly, and unbelievably beautiful UH-1 Huey, its familiar whomp whomp whomp, a symphony in the raging storm, its landing lights cutting through the thick rain and swirling fog, was nothing short of a vision of salvation. It was, many would later say, the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. The men of Anya's crew, the dinosaur platoon as they were derisively called, their faces grim and set with exhaustion from their own battle against the elements, did not waste a second. The moment the Huey settled onto the snow-covered ground, they dropped their ramps and began to unload the precious cargo, crates of ammunition, desperately needed boxes of medical supplies, canisters of fresh, life-saving water, and a few thermoses of hot coffee that seemed to radiate pure warmth. The elite high-speed Special Forces soldiers, their initial shock giving way to a deep, humbling wave of raw gratitude, worked alongside the grizzled old truckers. Their hands, which were used to the delicate precision of a rifle trigger, now gripped the rough, heavy edges of the supply crates, their movements clumsy but filled with urgency. In that small, rain-swept clearing, in the very heart of a raging storm that had brought modern technology to its knees, the rigid, artificial hierarchy of the military utterly dissolved. There were no warriors and workers here. There were only soldiers, united by a shared, unspoken bond of desperate survival and a profound, newfound respect, a mutual recognition of competence that transcended rank or generation. The cold, the exhaustion, the lingering threat of the enemy were all present, but in that moment, a flicker of humanity, of shared purpose, shone through. The return journey was, as expected, as treacherous and unforgiving as the first, a relentless battle against the elements, but the mood in the convoy had subtly, profoundly changed. They were no longer just a platoon of obsolete truckers. dismissed and mocked by the new guard. They were, in their own quiet way, saviors. Each bone-jarring lurch of the trucks, each screaming gust of wind against the Huey's fuselage, was met not with complaint, but with a silent, determined resilience. When they finally rumbled back through the main gate of FOB Vanguard, hours later caked in mud and snow, there was no welcoming committee waiting under the dim sodium lamps. There was no cheering crowd, no official ceremony, no blaring trumpets to mark their impossible return. But the atmosphere on the base was undeniably different. The news of their impossible successful mission, the mission that had saved Goliath Team where all others had failed, had spread like wildfire, whispered from comms room to barracks, from mess hall to hangar, as Anya led her convoy of battered, mud-splattered vehicles back to their forgotten corner of the motor pool. The young tech-savvy officers and engineers, who had once openly mocked them, now stood in a quiet, respectful silence. They watched the old battered trucks pass, their faces a mixture of awe, stunned disbelief, and a dawning, uncomfortable sense of their own profound and almost fatal ignorance about what truly mattered when the algorithms failed. At the entrance to the motor pool, the colonel was waiting alone. He did not speak a word. He simply stood there, in the pouring, freezing rain, and as Anya's lead truck, the old Huey now parked nearby, passed him, he raised his hand in a slow, formal, and deeply respectful salute, a gesture that spoke volumes where words were inadequate. It was, Anya understood, an apology, an acknowledgement, and a testament to a lesson hard learned. The Golem program, the ambitious initiative focused on advanced autonomous systems, was not entirely scrapped, but it was profoundly and fundamentally re-evaluated. The catastrophic failure of the rescue mission, the undeniable grounding of the multi-million-dollar Ospreys in the face of natural chaos, had been a brutal but ultimately necessary lesson for Major Kent and the entire command structure. A new, mandatory protocol was immediately added to all future autonomous operations, a protocol that was based on a single, simple, and now utterly undeniable principle. For every piece of high-tech autonomous equipment, there must absolutely be a low-tech, human-operated, analog backup. The age of unbridled faith in technology had ended, replaced by a renewed, if grudging, respect for human adaptability. The colonel, in a move that stunned the entire command staff, officially renamed the M939 truck platoon. They were no longer the dinosaurs, a term of derision. They were now, by official decree, the Guardians, a name that recognized their unwavering reliability and their quiet, often unseen heroism. And he asked Master Sergeant Eva Rostova, the woman he had once dismissed as a mere relic of a bygone era, the woman who had deliberately disobeyed his direct orders and in doing so had saved a dozen lives and, quite frankly, his own career, to completely rewrite the base's entire logistics doctrine. Her quiet, stubborn, and deeply unfashionable competence had not just won a battle, it had fundamentally changed a philosophy, a mindset that had prioritized data over dirt, algorithms over intuition. It had quite simply become the new standard. The path is clear. You